please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker, Mary McGinn, today. Thank you, Abby, for the lovely introduction, and welcome, and thank you for joining me today. I'd like to just introduce you to a general sense of what conservation is and what sort of things happen here at PAFA, how we manage a collection, how we preserve it, how we maintain it. And mostly it will be stories about individual objects that I've treated. I'd like to leave a lot of time at the end for questions, because I'd like to keep this more of a interactive than a lecture. So usually when we think of conservation, we think of it in terms of the jobs that someone has to do, and it's in a particular order sometime as well. But the first thing that I would do if I had an object was to examine it carefully. And it's really important to put the time in to do that job, to understand it, because art objects are not at all predictable. Artists are individuals. They make choices about their materials and techniques, how they're going to put them together. And then after those pieces are made, they live a life that I am not necessarily going to understand. Some things come into our collection when they're brand new. Some things come into our collection when they're 100 years old or older. So it's hard to emphasize how much a thorough examination of an object and an understanding of it is important to the eventual treatment of it. So the tools, I'm going to go over a little bit the tools that we use, but one of the most important tools we use is and I didn't practice this first with my pointer, I think it's this, is an examination microscope. It's just a binocular microscope. It's something that someone might use in a lab. It's something that they use in the chip industry to look at fine things. And to really understand something, sometimes you just have to see it in fine detail. So on the left here is a picture. Almost all of the pictures here are going to be from our collection. If not, they'll be listed as coming from someplace else. So the detail at right is at high magnification, so you can see a crack in the paint. You can actually see the fabric. In some cases, an artist will not use a ground, or they will use a ground, and you might not understand that until you look at it under a microscope. This is another way we look at objects, is just to manipulate the light while we're examining it or while we're documenting it, while we're taking photographs. So on the right is a raking light image of the painting by Thomas Hart Benton. And I think you can see that the texture tells you a lot more about the painting than just an image where the lights are coming on in two different directions. And I'll show you a detail of this. This was going out on loan, and there was a lot of very minute flaking happening, and really it was only possible to document that, to illustrate that, and to really understand it with the use of raking light photography and with a binocular microscope to both look at it, understand it, and eventually treat it. Another tool that we use here at PAFA, and most museums have it, is X-radiography. So oftentimes this is prompted by, you'd wonder, why would you X-ray a painting, or do you X-ray every painting? And really we X-ray paintings only when there's a question. And in this case, our Tanner painting, sorry, I'll get over this. You can see there's a ghostly image on the right, which clued the conservator in at the time that there was something going on that didn't have anything to do with the painting we were looking at. And that, in fact, under X-radiography, you can see Nicodemus here, and then you can see this ghostly image. Now, any of you here are artists are probably not surprised by this. I think a lot of artists reuse their canvases often. And you see the smiling, we don't have money, or we really hate the thing we did, and so we move on. A couple other examples from the collection. This is a self-portrait of by Thomas Sully. And it's pretty evident, and you can't see it in this light, but there's some really strange impasto in his jacket that doesn't really make any sense. It's not a button, it's not a lapel. So this was X-rayed, and you can see there's definitely something else going on. You can see Sully's portrait here. The whites are going to look whiter because they're denser, just like when you get an X-ray done of your body, your bones show up white because they're denser. And artists were using lead white pretty much exclusively till the 1920s. So this is Mr. Sully, but if we flip the image, you can see there's a portrait, probably, it looks like a portrait of a woman, and he apparently, I like to, when I have school groups come and I show them this, I let them make up a story about why. Why did he cover up this portrait? There's some pretty interesting ones that they come up with. So again, this doesn't really affect the treatment, but it helps us understand. I've seen instances where restorers in the past have scrubbed away at a painting because they saw some impasto that they didn't understand, and they ended up scrubbing through original paint in the effort to find something to uncover something. So with imaging like this, we can appreciate the change, but we don't really have to literally physically uncover it. Another great example that we uncovered just recently, David, this isn't working. Okay, let's try one more time. Oh, no. Okay. All right, without the image. Is it possible to get that X-ray, David? No, okay. So we're gonna have to skip ahead. So this is a painting in our collection. It's from a group of objects we got from Violet Oakley's studio. And it was really, you can see it's not a finished painting, but we do show a lot of paintings that are not finished. And in the process of looking at this, I realized, again, there was some really strange impasto that didn't make any sense with the image. So we X-rayed it, and I was going to flip it, but basically it was upside down, just like Sully's, and it's actually not unusual. Andrew Wyeth, or N.C. Wyeth, and Andrew Wyeth did the same thing. When they reused a canvas, they almost always turned it on its side or upside down and worked on it again. Sometimes to take advantage of the interesting shapes in the original composition, sometimes not to, just to clear their eyes. But you can see, when we turned it upside down, we saw this image, and I had an intern who Googled, and she quickly found this image that Violet Oakley did that was published in Century Magazine in 1908. So we know that under our painting, we have another painting that's upside down. Now, we also know, because of the large collection of Oakleys we have, that she did numerous sketches for most of her things. And so it's not unlikely, I'm not suggesting that this is the original painting that was then reproduced. It could very well have been a preparatory study. It seems to be very loosely done. So that's the sort of thing we can find with X-rays. The other thing it can also tell us is if there's a tear in a painting. We're not sure. We're not sure if we can see restoration on the surface, but we don't know if it's gone through. You can do an X-ray, and if the original paint and the original ground is missing from a lead white-based painting, you're going to clearly see a dark mark where it's been torn. Another imaging technique that we use for examination and documentation is infrared. So infrared light is not visible to our eyes. It's in the warmer spectrum of the light range, but certain pigments will absorb it, and other pigments will let it through. So the most simple thing it's used for is just to see the labels that are really dirty on the back of a piece of furniture or a frame. So the labels are typically made from carbon, some form of carbon black, and the dirt is not carbonaceous, so if you can get through that dirt with the IR camera, you can then get an image of that clarifies the piece. For paintings, we can often see what is underneath a painting if the paint colors are not too thick, depends on the pigment that's on top. But what you're going to see, again, underneath is something that's made from carbon. So if the painter used a black ink made from carbon, or black paint made from carbon, or even a chalk or a charcoal, you will often see that. So these are details from our painting Death on a Pale Horse, which is always on display in the other building. And in this case, you can see the changes that the artist made, even in visible light, but you can see them much more clearly with the infrared reflectography. In this case, you can really see sometimes with the artist making changes and struggling in a way that you can't see with visible light. And then in this other detail, it's even more clear. What's not really visible in normal light is visible with IR. So sometimes when a painting, when we're not sure of the authenticity of a painting, is it a copy, is it original? You can often find an original because you can see that struggle by the artist, that changing, that moving, that drawing, that active drawing underneath the painting. And again, this is non-destructive testing like X-radiography. We don't remove anything or damage anything by doing it. So I talked a little bit about documentation. It's really important to document what we do, and I find that out here when we have paintings come into the collection and I have no idea what their life has been, how they've been treated, what materials have been used on it. I have to figure that out just by testing. I had just yesterday, so I had to throw this slide in, just yesterday, when I was at Winterthur Museum, we bought this painting, and it came with a label on the back, and the label was for the conservation business that had treated it. And I called Susan at Westlake Conservators, and she was thrilled. She said, I do all this documentation, I save everything, I give it to my clients, and now I know why I do it. So she sent us a package with a CD and all the images and all the reports that she had done for that picture. So if you ever are engaging a conservator, you should definitely expect to get documentation if you're having work treated. And if you pass it on to your children or to an auction house, try to pass that along, because it usually doesn't happen. And so literally just yesterday, a gentleman called me from Indiana. He found me. I was in private practice for 12 years, but he called me at PAFA, and I said, you must be wanting to talk to somebody else. I don't know why you'd want to talk to me. I've only been here 5 years. And then he described the painting, and I said, oh, the little girl's from Indiana. And he had bought the painting at auction, had no records, and he was convinced that the artist's signature was on the back. And so I dug up my records, and I sent them to him last night. So I didn't line the painting. The painting came to me already lined. We'll talk about lining in a minute. But it has a signature here, and he's bound and determined to take that lining off to see if there's a signature on the back. And I said, but don't do that. Don't risk the painting just because there might be a signature on the back. So that dilemma of what to cover up and what not to cover up, we'll talk about again later. So the main, the biggest time, I won't call it a time sink, the biggest pleasure of my job is to actually treat the paintings, and it does take a great deal of time, and I've been privileged and fortunate to have had interns work with me over the past 5 years. Some have been volunteers, some have been work-study students through PAFA, some have been young people who are interested in going into conservation as a career, and they need to get hours in a museum lab or a private practice in order to qualify for grad school. Sometimes we can pay them, sometimes we can't. And these are two PAFA grads who worked with me when we were treating the Ree Morton piece, which is, she's now quite, there's exhibits all over the place, so it's traveling a lot now. And so some tasks in conservation are fairly easy to have somebody do with a little bit of supervision, because it can be very, very repetitive. Unfortunately. So I'm just going to talk about some treatments that I think are interesting and illustrate some of the basic processes that go into treating a painting to preserve it. So this is a lovely landscape by Elizabeth Fisher Washington in our collection, and this, whereas most of my time or my job is driven by exhibitions, loans, and new acquisitions, when I have an intern who's really focused on getting into school, I try to find a treatment that they can do that has no pressure. It's not something we're planning for exhibition. It's not something going on loan. It's just something in our collection that needs to be treated, and then it will become available for the curators to use, because in this condition, the condition I found it in like this, it really wasn't exhibitable. So it really illustrates a lot of the processes that go into treating a painting. So it was clearly dirty, and when people talk about cleaning paintings, sometimes they're talking about taking dirt off, and sometimes they're talking about taking a varnish off. And in this case, given the extent of the discoloration, I was assuming this was a dirty varnish, but it turns out it's just dirt, but very intractable dirt. So, the cleaning process was really took about 3 passes of different materials, sort of unpacking it layer by layer. The most loose dirt came off in a simple aqueous solution, and then the second cleaning pass required incorporating a chelating agent and a solvent into an emulsion to get the really tough dirt off. And then the third pass was actually with solvents, because there was, despite the fact that it's an impressionist painting, it was originally varnished. And this was quite a journey for the intern and for me. And I show you a picture. Sometimes, especially if someone is using this as a portfolio piece to illustrate their work, we'll do a during treatment picture just to illustrate that. Sometimes it can be a little disturbing because it almost seems like it's too bright until you see it finished. So this, I think, illustrates well the unpacking. So this is the first. The first cleaning, you could hardly see the difference, just to get the loose dirt off. And then this part came off with the tougher emulsion. And then you can see how much more yellow this is than that. And that's just because there's little bits of varnish that were left in the pretty high impasto of this painting. So it was really a three-part cleaning, and ultimately a very little bit of varnish had to be removed. And this this speaks to the question of varnishing. So oftentimes people say, well, should you varnish a painting? Why would you ever take a varnish off? And why would you ever varnish a painting that had never been varnished before? So this illustrates a case where if this painting had come to us with no evidence of varnish on, we would have done our very best to not varnish it again. But since it had remnants of a natural resin varnish on it, and we could see that without the varnish it looked a little chalky and a little unsaturated, we did choose to varnish this painting. So this picture is going to be after varnishing and in painting, and this is during cleaning. So this is a case where the varnish was there was evidence of having varnishes we're able to do again. There are certain times when paintings don't have evidence of varnishing, and you can sometimes and sometimes not justify varnishing. This is just a detail of the same treatment, just to see, it gives you a sense of the impasto and the thickness of the dirt. Okay. Another way that we can sometimes dig in and examine a painting, I must mean that literally, is if we're not understanding a surface, we can actually take a sample from a painting. And this would be the sample the size of the head of a pin. And it's mounted in a resin cube and polished so that you can see it in cross-section, almost like the layers of a cake. So this is that same painting. It's a pretty simple structure. It has a ground layer, and then this was from the sky. So really just one simple paint layer where we took the actual sample. It was a very complicated painting, but when we do these samples, we're taking a very, very small part to see. And this is that sample in ultraviolet light. And what we were looking for is to try and figure out what this material on top, which we ultimately figured out was a natural resin varnish. These varnishes often fluoresce in UV light, and so we can kind of confirm that. And in this case, we did not get confirmation that way. We ended up putting the painting under that binocular microscope I showed you, shining an ultraviolet light on it, turning the lights off in the room, and we could see it glowing under the microscope, which I did not capture on as a picture. But that's a kind of thing, a cross-section microscopy is often done, but usually for a reason. It can be for understanding the art historical materials. If someone's doing a study of Cézanne's work, they might justify taking a sample to really understand his technique. But more often than not, it's done to understand for treatment reasons. What is this material? You can also take some of these, you can actually take with a tiny scalpel, remove bits of these samples, and send them for analysis to see what the paint medium is or the resin is. And this is another painting that's currently in the galleries across the street. And it was an intern project. There was no deadline for it. There was no need for it. It was just a painting that was not exhibitable before. And this lovely portrait by Thomas Sully is one of 3 of the same sitter. Yeah, really. Frances Kemble, an actress. We have her in 3 different roles, and so now they're all together. And this, again, was a combination of a cleaning and a structural treatment. I can show you in raking light on the left, you can see that there are a lot of undulations in the canvas, a little pucker at the corner. It's pretty unusual to find a painting from 1836 that has not been lined. So we kind of treat them like the Holy Grail and do our very best not to line them. And so despite the fact that if you go to the gallery and you'll see it's kind of high on the wall, it sometimes still looks a little wavy, and that's partly because it's difficult to look at a painting that's high on the wall and have it lit properly. But the other thing is in the summer it might look a little more wavy, in the winter a little less wavy. But the idea of not adding something to this painting is preferable, especially in an institution where we know we can keep an eye on it and take care of it. So on the back of this is an inscription by the artist. So it's kind of important in this case not to line it if at all possible. So here it is, basically. This is just illustrating how little damage there was to the painting. It really was just a dirty varnish. And you can see just a few spots where paint had chipped away and just a little bit of abrasion. It's really in remarkably pristine condition. And that's kind of the highlight of if a conservator's job is to find a painting that really has only suffered a little bit from the ravages of time, but not from the intervention that maybe was not well thought out. So this is a cross-section from that painting, and in this case you can see, you have here the ground layer, and then the paint, and then two layers. You can see two distinct layers in UV of varnish. So we were trying to figure out on the dark mantle of the figure whether there was an original varnish that we needed to be careful of because the browns are so sensitive. So this guided our treatment in this case, and we just backed off. So in a case like this, you don't clean a painting always the same way with the same material. So we know that white paint catalyzes the oxidation and the polymerization of the paint, whereas brown paint actually does the opposite. So when you're cleaning a painting, you should never see somebody taking a rag to clean a painting, because what the chemicals that you need to use to remove most of these historic resin varnishes are fairly strong, and you have to really almost check each color to see if it's going to be sensitive. So in this case, we cleaned this part of the painting in quite a different way than this part of the painting. So this is back to Elizabeth Fisher Washington. I wanted to talk a little bit about structural work. So we sort of think of a painting in terms of its aesthetic condition and its structural condition. And of course, our first concern is structural. We don't want the paint falling off. We don't want it to deteriorate. If it has a yellow varnish, it's not going to make a big difference whether we take it off now or in 10 years. It's going to make a difference to the curator, but it's not going to make a big difference to the painting. So we usually attend to the structural issues first. Well, not always first, because you don't want to put a painting through the heat and pressure of lining while it has dirt on the surface or an oxidized resin or something like that. So you often clean a painting first, but it's in preparation for, or with the idea in mind that you may have to do structural work eventually. So in this case, you can see that this painting in raking light, again, I'm using the light from the side to emphasize the damage. So over time, because the canvas it's missing some keys and it just got slumped on its stretcher, and you can see that it was quite buckled, and it had these very sharp creases where the painting had it not just banging against those stretcher bars, but actually there's a difference between the atmosphere that the paint feels here and the atmosphere that the paint feels there, because the wood is blocking the air and the moisture. And so you end up getting a crease there. It's really more of a crease than a mechanical crack. And unfortunately, this just happens with time. So in most cases, like I said, we try to avoid lining whenever possible, but there are two things happening here that only a lining is going to address. And one is to flatten those creases and prevent them from getting worse again. And the other is, you can see the pretty extreme cracking in that paint. And so when paintings crack like that, the paint tends to curl up. We call it cupping. And then when the edges curl up, the paint is liable to flake off, and it's also impossible to clean it, because if you're rolling a swab or trying to rub something or roll something on the surface, you're likely to catch an edge of a paint chip and flake it off. So in some cases, you have to do your structural work before cleaning, or you have to do part of the cleaning before and part of the cleaning afterwards. So in this case, I showed you the cleaning images. We actually took it off the stretcher, and this is a suction hot table in the lab, and the painting is humidified for at least 8 hours, up to just below the humidity level that would make the canvas shrink. So there's a humidity level in the low to mid 80s that will allow the paint to soften to the point where it's pliable enough to be put back into plane, but before the canvas starts to shrink. So the thing about paintings is there are these lamellar structures made of vastly different materials. You have canvas, which loves water. You have animal skin glue in a traditional painting, which is used to size the linen, and that loves water even more. And then you have paint, which doesn't particularly like water. So when the humidity goes up in a space, the fabric swells, the glue swells and becomes weak, and the paint kind of goes along for the ride until it gets old and brittle, and then it starts to crack. And it cracks in pretty predictable ways. And eventually that cracking starts to become deformed, and then a treatment like this is in order. So the humidification allows us to soften the paint so that we can use the heat and pressure of this table to bring it back into plane. And typically the only way that's going to stay in plane is to have another piece of fabric glued to the back of it with a heat set reversible fabric that can be removed if necessary. And it's really a physics problem. I'm not going to get into the physics, but basically you have to put a new layer in there so that the load gets pushed down, and then the paint doesn't curl up again. So this is a raking light shot before and after treatment. So of course the cleaning was also done, but you can see those creases, they're not completely gone. We want the painting to look like a painting. We don't want it to look like it's a new painting. We just want it to read like a landscape and not something we want the image to be clear, but we want it to look its age, I guess is the way I would put it. And this is the back. So you can see we kept all of the original fabric. It's all glued to a new piece of fabric. We always use, well, I always use a synthetic fabric because it doesn't absorb water. We want to mitigate against those swings in relative humidity and the damage they can cause.